Hello and welcome to No-Till Permanent Raised Beds and Weed Management with Jennifer Wilhelm at NOFA New Hampshire's 20th Annual Winter Conference. I'm Laura Andrews, NOFA New Hampshire's Program Coordinator, and I will be hosting this session today with Julie Davidson, NOFA New Hampshire Board Member. First, please note that we're recording this session and all sessions throughout the conference, and we'll share the recordings with you. Some are available now on the workshop links page, and we'll send an email when they're all uploaded. So today you can type your questions into the chat box and we can read them out for you, or you will also have the option to unmute along the way. So feel free to raise your hand or unmute and ask questions when you have them. NOFA New Hampshire's Winter Conference is supposed to foster an open, welcoming environment and a safe space for everyone. So please keep your questions and comments constructive in the chat. For technical issues, please feel free to communicate publicly through the chat or message me or Julie privately. If you'd like to access closed captioning, click on the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's an arrow just to the right of that. Click on that and select Show Subtitle. And if you're watching in a smaller screen, that might be under 3 dots and more, and click on that and then select the Show Subtitle option from there. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on the land of the Pennacook tribe, or Ndakina, the Abenaki word for the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples past and present, and we acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Alnovak, or people, who have stewarded this land through the generations. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Wilhelm of Fat Peach Farm.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to share my screen here. How does that look for people? Can you see that? Okay, great.
Perfect.
So as Laura mentioned, we're going to be talking about no-till permanent raised beds today, specifically related to weed management. And I want you to feel free to interrupt, ask questions, stop me at any time if anything is unclear. I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So as Laura said, you can either put a comment in the chat and she'll read it out, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. So weed management and organic systems, as you all probably know, often require tilling or rely on tilling, which can compromise soil health. It disturbs the weed seed bank. So while you're prepping the bed at first and giving your crop seeds a bit of an advantage, eventually those weed seeds that you've pulled up from below can become an issue. And of course, to be able to do that, you'll need either a rototiller or a tractor. And that can be expensive both to purchase and to maintain over time. A lot of folks in organic production also rely on plasticulture, which again costs money, requires special equipment to put down. And then you're creating waste products. For a lot of crops, it's great that it heats the soil and that can help us get in earlier or help extend the season, but some crops may not prefer that extra heat. And then of course there's manual labor if you're out there with some tools and hand weeding, which is both costly for hourly rates, but also a daily, if not weekly, effort. So what are permanent no-till raised beds? We're going to talk a little bit about how we develop them and also how they work over time. So essentially, unlike what we think of as a permanent raised bed as something that's high up and boxed in agricultural systems, the permanent raised beds are at the ground level. It just signifies a space that is not walked on or disturbed. So we have permanent walkways and the beds remain where they are each year. So you're not reshaping new beds. So the supply list is pretty simple. You can use different organic materials to smother the weed seed bank, which is essentially what we used wood chips to do. So, and I only have experience with wood chips, so I'm gonna focus on that. I know other people have used cardboard and other organic materials, but I'll just speak about wood chips. So you'll also want some weed seed-free compost, because the way that it works is you're building the beds on top of the wood chips, and then materials to mark out each bed for development. And I'll show you some pictures for what that looks like. But quickly, a note on wood chips. So raymeal wood chips are best management practice for building these. They break down quickly. They're hard to come by and they're hard to make. So while they're sort of the best of the best for wood chips, any hardwood chips except locust and walnut are really ideal. So we built our permanent raised beds with regular hardwood chips. We didn't use raymeal. It's best to avoid large quantities of pine because of the acidity. And either way, if you're using raymeal or hardwood chips, it takes a while for them to break down. So when you build the system, as the wood chips are breaking down, they're taking nitrogen out of the soil, and you're essentially building a new soil ecosystem, right? So that takes a while to establish. And what we found was that if we use cover crops for the first year, then by year 2, we were off and running with our cash crops.
Jennifer, there are a couple questions from the
Okay.
chat. Are the wood chips with or without foliage?
Oh, good question. We use them without, but I don't think that it matters if there are leaves and green material in there. I think that's okay. And I'll talk about the ratios of how much wood chips you want to use when you're building them.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, green is okay.
And what are your bed widths and walkway widths?
So the bed widths are 32 inches and the walkways are about 18 inches. And we chose those dimensions because they fit well with equipment that already exists out there, like the hoops for low tunnel systems and floating row cover, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we did some calculations for how much it costs to build this, and it's about $200 per 100-foot bed. So our beds are 100 feet. In one of our gardens, the beds are 100 feet long by 32 inches by 4 inches. So the wood chips are about 5 inches thick. So what we did was we mowed the lawn or the sod as short as we could. We covered the lawn with 5 inches of wood chips, and then we took the weed seed free compost and built the beds on top, which were about 4 inches thick. And that just for the materials, that's about $200. So if you were to do a full acre, it would be about 105 raised beds per acre, which is about $21,000. And if you compare that to, startup costs of purchasing tractors or tillers or the plastic for plastic culture, et cetera. And I haven't done that math. I should, to get a comparison, but I would guess that it's pretty comparable, especially considering you don't have expensive maintenance costs over time. So just to give you a lay of our land, we have 2 gardens. This one that's at the top with the geodesic dome, those beds are about 45 feet long, 32 inches wide with the 18-inch paths. And then the garden down below has the 100-foot beds. So when we bought the property, this is what it looked like. We had all lawn. That was in 2013. And this the same field just from the top looking down. The back garden, so where you see that little shed, there's where the geodesic dome is now. But as you can see, we are mostly on sand, and that sand, when we dug a water line that goes down 6 or 8 feet. So we think we're on a glacial esker with all this sand. But regardless, it's marginal soil at best. There's, a very thin layer of organic matter on top. So that was really the catalyst or the drive behind wanting to build the system, to get more organic matter faster. And we found over time that it had this amazing benefit of suppressing weed seeds. So yeah, our choice to do the permanent raised bed system was really around trying to build soil organic matter as fast as we could. So as I mentioned, you need the wood chips and compost. So we had that trucked in. We spread the wood chips out and then used just wooden stakes with some string to measure the beds and then build them. This garden is a little bit different from the others. This is a perennial garden, our newest growing space. But you can see that we just put the wood chips on top of the grass and then built the beds on top. So one thing I found in terms of, suppressing the weed seed bank is great. The sod or the lawn will start to creep in on the sides. So once a year, we take an edging tool and go along the edge to keep the sod from creeping in. This year, I'm going to experiment with planting some seedless comfrey because that's supposed to be a good block for edging. So perhaps next year or in a couple of years, I can report back on how that works. We also use silage tarps. So although we don't have weed seeds coming up from the seed bank, they can blow in from the field across the street, or we can have volunteers from crops that we grew in previous years. So if, cherry tomatoes have dropped or flowers, we don't get them before they go to seed, then they're laying on the soil surface. So using the silage tarp to warm up the soil, get those seeds to germinate, and then they die because they don't have the light and it's too hot. So we put that on the beds for a couple of weeks before we plant. And there's research that shows that silage tarps are effective. UNH did some research using clear tarps and the black tarps. And we found that the black tarps, or they found that the black tarps are quite effective. Jean-Martin Fortier up in Canada uses them. He's found them effective. So while, that is a lot of plastic, we've had the same tarps for 7 years now. So they last a long time. We also use a tilther for bed prep. And I have this link, but I don't think it's going to work. No, I was going to show you how it works, but this is just a little power drill that's connected to some tines that spin and fluff up the first inch or two of soil. So we're not tilling and getting down deep into the weed seed bank. We're just staying at the surface level to make it easier for usually direct seeding. When we use the tilther, it's usually for direct seeding so that the seeder can work through the soil easier. Does anyone have any questions?
There's a question about the tarps.
Okay.
When they're solarizing the soil, how does that affect the soil biology?
Yeah, you definitely don't want to leave it on too long. I'm not sure about research that has been done on the soil biology or ecology, like what is happening with the good bacteria and earthworms and that sort of thing. I haven't found it to be negative in terms of production or, I guess production would really be the biggest indicator. We haven't seen any negative effects on production. Certainly not like after we've just built the beds and try to plant in them. Once they're established after that first year and we use the tarps, we haven't seen any issues. But that is something I should probably look into a little bit more to see, yeah, if there's some research on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I have found that if the tarps are on too long, we get moles and voles. It attracts more moles and voles because they're protected. And so, it's generally speaking, both for the soil ecology and for that purpose, best not to leave them on for longer than 2 or 3 weeks. We also use cover crops. So this is buckwheat here. And we generally try to keep the soil covered, whether with salt marsh hay or cover crop, as much as possible, just to protect the soil from both shifting, but also eroding. So we got some funding from a NISAIR grant a couple of years ago to do research on this system. And so these next 2 slides show some of what we found. In the first, we tracked the time we spent weeding each day. And over the course of a season from May to October, the first year, if I'm remembering correctly, because I don't see it listed here, we spent about 36 hours weeding, and the second year was about 38 hours. And I would love to see how this compares to a traditional organic system. How many hours does a traditional organic farm spend on labor hours weeding? Just to put this in perspective, because from my perspective with this system, 36 to 38 hours a year a season is not that much time. And you'll see, it sort of changes by month. So what year was it? 2019. That's right. In 2018, that was the mast year for maples, and our property is lined by maples. So we had a lot of little maple seedlings that we were weeding out of there. And we did find also, because we collected soil from the weed seed bank and grew that out in the greenhouse in a soilless growing medium. So we found that there is a high diversity of weeds in the system, but a very low abundance. So they're just not growing in our system. And then just to touch on soil health really briefly, the slide or the chart on the left shows a soil sample or aggregation of soil sample we collected from the surrounding sod compared to soil samples from the growing space. And if you look at the overall quality score at the bottom, we had surprisingly decent score for our surrounding sod, but the soil system that's in our permanent raised bed area is optimal for growing. So it did its job in terms of building soil organic matter effectively. So here's just a handful of pictures showing the before and after. So sorry, these are a little blurry and dark, but hopefully you get the sense for how things have changed. So in 2014 again, and 2017, we do rotate crops every year. So you'll see this from the same or similar vantage point in 2019. And then 2020, we had garlic up there. This last season, we had onions and tomatoes and carrots. Down below. So just, you can see here, actually we used, and I think this is part of the reason why we had, in 2018, we were weeding so many maples, because you can see we chopped up maple leaves to use as mulch. So we were inadvertently introducing the weed seeds. But regardless, chopped up maple leaves, they worked really well as a mulch there. Because we have such a small space, we try to plant intensively, and it seems to work pretty well. Some spinach and beets. And we're not doing farmers markets anymore, but we do grow a diversity of crops. So just trying to give you a sense for what the produce from a system like this looks like. Lots of different crop types. And we did strawberries 1 year or 2 years, actually. We did a bunch of day neutral strawberries, experimented with that system, lots of garlic. And we got into cut flowers a couple of years ago. And then I just wanted to mention, in terms of seeing the diversity of wildlife on the farm. So when we first moved here and just had lawn, we didn't really see very many songbirds or other animals. So once we built the system out, it's clear that the birds were finding not only places to rest, but food to eat and habitat. We had lots of monarchs, praying mantis on the carrots, little snake in the cucumbers. Yeah, so that's the long and short of it. I don't know if anyone has any other questions.
There are a couple in the chat.
Okay.
Wondering where you got the domes and if they're both being used as greenhouse space.
The dome?
Yes. Oh,
So
is it just one?
Yeah, there's one
Okay.
geodesic dome, and that is from a company called Growing Spaces out in Colorado. It's a kit, and it comes pre-cut and coated, so it's relatively easy to put together. And then the other smaller hoop house type greenhouse we just found on Craigslist.
Thank you. Is there ever a reason to use a shovel to turn over soil deeper to get to mineral soil?
There are different philosophies on this. Personally, I wouldn't do that here because, as I mentioned, it would stir up the weed seed bank. In fact, I didn't mention this, but some of the other things we do to minimize that are like we cut crops with deep root systems like tomatoes, eggplant, peppers. We cut the plants at the stem at the soil surface. So we're not pulling the plant out and pulling all the weeds, weed seeds from below. So yeah, some people double dig and, we'll dig down and turn around, and that's just a different type of system. And I can't speak to that in terms of how it functions with weed management. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any comments on Charles Dowding and No Dig?
I don't. I'm sorry. I don't know who that is.
Thank you. What's your total cultivation area?
So we have about 1/4 of an acre in production in the permanent raised bed system. And then we have a small orchard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And asking for a couple recommendations, where is a good source for compost, and where can you get ramial wood chips?
So my husband is an arborist, and he was just mentioning that there's a lot of wood chips right now. I think, if I'm not misspeaking, that's in part because of the biomass industry for energy and some laws that were not, or some legislation that was not renewed to support or to incentivize the use of biomass. So there's a lot of wood chips out there right now. So, start maybe by contacting your local arborists. And then for compost, one of the things that we found was that different sources had different quality compost, and doing your research on the compost available in your area, I think, is really important. We found out that one of the sources locally, a compost company uses sludge, which, if you're following the news about PFAS and forever chemicals, you want to be really careful about what you're bringing onto your farm. And of course, if you're organic certified, you need to make sure that it's an OMRI certified product. So be really careful about it. With wood chips, I think it's a little less concerning because it's typically just chipped trees, but doesn't hurt to ensure that it's not being mixed with anything else. But certainly with the compost, do your research in your area for the companies and how they make the compost.
Thank you. And Julie added in the chat that Stonewall Farm out in Keene has organic composted cow manure sold in bulk or by the bag as well.
Okay. My husband just gave me, I guess he's listening to me. He just gave me a note that says there's an app called Chip Drop, CHIPDROP, so that you can get wood chips dropped at your farm. So there you go.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone had a comment about compost and they thought that only bagged compost is OMRI certified.
Oh,
Do you know about anything about that? Oh,
I don't.
New Hampshire state has different rules, I guess.
I don't, I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else on the call knows. Feel free to chime in. I'm not sure.
Hi, my name is Ann Whitemare of Foundwell Farm, and because I use the compost in my potting soil for my operations, what I can tell you is that my organic certifier from the Department of Ag basically says that as long as there is compost that they will, state or certify that they're not using manure or sludge or anything like that, I can use it. If they are using manure, they have to keep pretty clear records of temperature and such like that, which makes sense. Not everybody does that. And often there are places like Dirt Doctors or whatever, which will gladly advertise organic compost, but nobody has certified it. Nobody. You really, if you want to stick with the certified organic part, you really have to check with your certifier before you do anything, because in New Hampshire, they don't organically certify compost, but if you use the wrong stuff, it can take your certification away, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. So I was wondering who you used for soil analysis and comparison.
Cornell soil health tests or the soil lab. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And another comment about soil amendments. Frank shared a link in the chat to Benson Farm in Gorham, Maine is MOFGA certified and has a retail outlet in Ossipee and at Windy Ridge Farm. And I guess that's organic cow manure and has lobster in it.
Great. Yeah, and one thing that just came to mind about the system and management over time. So because, the soil is sitting on top of the wood chips and, it will shift around a little bit over time. So just in terms of management, I'd say probably once a year when we're planting and prepping beds, we'll take a rake and rake up the edges to keep the beds from just sort of flattening out over time. So that's an important management practice I forgot to mention. Yeah.
How deep did you say the beds were?
So we did about 4 inches of compost on top of 5 inches of wood chips. So after a year of the wood chips breaking down, that's about 9 inches of soil, plus whatever was below it.
Okay.
Oh, and someone mentioned the double dig or digging with a shovel. You know, one thing you could do if you're concerned about accessing nutrients and minerals below is use a cover crop like daikon radish or tillage radish. And that can be a great way of pulling up some of those nutrients that are deeper below without stirring up the weed seed bank. And I did mention earlier that, you know, we're on marginal soils and mostly sand. And so that's my experience in terms of how this system works. And I know that soils vary greatly around the state and can even vary a lot on one individual property. So, you know, I'd love to see if more people adopt this method, to hear about experiences on different soil types, because, you know, how might it work with clay? How might it work, you know, on other sandy loams? We have found that the soil, it's good at holding water and draining below because of the sand. So if someone is on clay, I'm curious to see if it would be too wet. But just something to keep in mind, what you're building up from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Laura asks, is a raised bed with sides less effective than freeform beds?
I don't know that it would be less effective. I think it has more to do with material costs, labor to build it, you know, maintenance over time. This system, I think, you know, and of course this system has been around for generations, right? It's been used in countries around the world for a long time. It's just a cheaper, effective way of building organic matter and suppressing weeds. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Steve, one of our board members who's a certified organic farmer, had another comment about the compost. He clarified that you would need a statement from the compost supplier, if it's from another farm, to provide information that they follow the organic rules, like no sludge, maintaining temperature records, etc. So there's a record of it. Okay, another question, just reading that quickly. Did you say that you let the beds rest for a while before planting into them, like let the wood chips break down, or did you plant directly into the newly created beds?
So we did plant into them and learned the first year we built them, we planted into them and learned that the crops just didn't do well because they didn't have enough nitrogen, and we didn't want to be overloading the system with fertilizer additions. So we just learned through trial and error to wait a year, and we planted a cover crop in the meantime so that the soil was being held in place and covered, and we had some wildlife habitat attracting pollinators, etc. And then by the end of that first year, they were ready for cash crops.
Okay. Great, thank you. I think that is, oh. Another note about the compost, Joan just reminded everyone about invasive jumping worms, and make sure to ask the vendor where you're getting the compost from if they're monitoring for them, because you want to avoid having them in your gardens.
Yeah, and you know, bringing in materials in some ways is not ideal, right? Like, it's best if we can keep our systems as closed as possible, but if it depends, I guess, on what you're comparing the system to. And if you're comparing it to using tractors and other equipment, then trucking in outside amendments and wood chips, I think, can be a good alternative in some situations.
Thank you. Do you have a go-to person for managing insect pests?
Typically, I ask cooperative extension if I'm having any major issues. Like we had an Asiatic beetle infestation a couple of years ago that was wiping out, well, a lot of different things, but specifically the day neutral strawberries. So we went to cooperative extension and asked them for how best management practices. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on applying wood chips to walkways within already established garden beds?
Yeah, actually, I know several farmers who do that and have had luck doing that. So that's certainly one way to minimize weed pressure. Yeah, I think that's really effective. And I didn't mention this before either, but just thinking about, where the weeds are in your system, where they're most abundant, that's one way to maybe think about tackling or using a passive system like this to tackle that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Great. How do you remove the cover crop without messing up the bed?
So depending on what type of cover crop it is and where it is in its life stage, we use the silage tarp. We've also used a scythe to cut them down and then just leave the organic matter on top of the bed as a mulch itself. Yeah, I think those are the two methods we've used so far. You could probably, if you didn't have a scythe and you have a weed whacker with one of the bar attachment, you could use that to just kind of mow it down without touching the soil surface. And just, timing in terms of when you're planting the cover crop, because I guess the other technique is winter kill. So if you're planting something that can be killed in the winter, then you don't have to worry about it.
Have you used that before?
Winter kill? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. No questions in the chat currently. Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question?
Scholars are very shy this morning.
Yeah, very quiet. Steve says that common oats winter kill easily in New Hampshire. Just a note about that.
Yeah, we've had good luck with buckwheat, and we just started keeping bees 2 years ago, and the bees really love the buckwheat.
Very cool.
Yeah. But I did find, just one note on the buckwheat, that we let it go a little bit too long in some of the beds and ended up with buckwheat becoming, the weed the next year. So just keep that in mind.
Okay.
In terms of weeding, generally speaking, so, we have low abundance. It doesn't mean we have no weeds. So we still, when we're managing, we're still walking around pulling out weeds. I try to make sure that we get them before they go to seed, which in this system is possible because there's so few. But it is something to keep in mind because one plant can have hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds.
Yeah, you had showed that chart of time spent weeding in 2018 and 2019. How does it compare now? Is it more or less, or
I haven't tracked it the way that we did for that study because we were collecting data for the study, but I would say it's about the same. I haven't noticed any major spikes or decreases.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just by feel, it seems like it hasn't changed much.
Yeah, I mean, we're a pretty small operation. I have one employee at 10 hours a week and myself, and we're we're really not spending that much time. In fact, he barely spends time weeding. I usually do that, so he's focused on other things, and I haven't noticed a major difference.
Thank you. A few more questions came in. If you're planting fairly late, when do you plant your cover crops in raised beds?
If you're planting your cash crops late,
That's what it sounds like, but maybe they can clarify. Ellen, can you clarify? I'll just move to the next question. Oh, yes, if you're planting the cash crops later.
yeah, I mean, I think it just it depends on what you're planting and the maturity of each, both the cover crop and the cash crop. So you can plant a cover crop really any time of the growing season, depending on what it is and how long, you want it to be in the ground and be established. So I think maybe look at, so different cover crops offer different benefits. Some can help fix nitrogen, some can add organic matter. So maybe see what it is that your system needs and why you're using the cover crop, and then choose the cover crop that matches those needs. And then just look at, the life cycle or maturity dates on how long that cover crop needs to do what you need it to do, and then plan accordingly. I don't know if that's a helpful answer.
Thank you. Let's see who asked this. How did you know to remove the buckwheat in the spring?
So we typically plant the buckwheat in the fall, actually. I do some, so in beds that I'm going to not plant a cash crop in, I'll plant buckwheat in the spring. And then when it flowers, when I look at the flower and I see that seeds are going to start to form, that's when I'll kill it. And then in the fall, typically it winter kills. And so I don't have to worry about it when I plant the buckwheat in the fall.
Thank you. There are two cover crop questions from, and I guess I'll go backwards. Is buckwheat a good cover crop for midsummer? Could it be?
I think it can be. I have not planted it midsummer. I don't know if anyone else on the call has experience with that. Feel free to chime in. I've only done early spring and then early fall, I guess.
And do you have any recommendations of a good cover crop for a bed that's going to be fallow?
Again, I think it depends on, what your soil needs are. So I think it's a good idea if you haven't ever done soil tests to do some basic, even just basic soil tests. You may benefit from something like tillage radish if your soil is compacted, or if you're low on some of those minerals that are deeper in the soil. So I think I hesitate to make any specific recommendation, because I think it's really site specific and knowing what your goals are.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. It looks like Jeff and Kate have sown buckwheat through the summer months, and with good luck, it's fast growing and great at smothering weeds.
Great.
And Kathy also says buckwheat is a good smother crop for keeping weeds out and can be planted 3 times in succession in New Hampshire.
Great.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what you add yearly after developing the beds, if anything, I guess?
Yeah, so we we have done soil tests a couple of times, and based on the results of those, we've added more compost to some of the beds. But at this point, there's so much organic matter in the beds. It's more about making sure that the nutrient levels are good. And we found high nitrogen in some of them. And so we've tried to cut back on that. So again, I mean, soil tests can be expensive, and I wouldn't say that it's something that needs to be done annually, but it's certainly good to have a handle on the overall soil profile that you're working with. So we do use organic fertilizers, and we follow the protocol of that fertilizer for that particular crop. So if we're planting tomatoes, we use the appropriate fertilizer. But in terms of compost, we're really at this point not using compost as an amendment. It's mostly just organic fertilizers as needed.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
How many soil tests do you do in your one area? Like,
Yeah. So depending on who you're using, if you're using Cornell or the UNH soil lab or some other soil lab, they'll give you instructions on how deep to go with your soil sample and how many different samples to collect in a certain area. So just follow the protocol of whoever you're working with.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Any other questions?
Does anyone else on the call have experience with permanent raised beds?
I don't see anything coming up in the chat.
Like maybe Julie's typing, but. I'm just curious. I don't know, personally, I don't know anyone, but I know that there are lots of people in New England who are using them and have had, and New York, actually. I think I'm sure there are farms everywhere, but that I know of. But it'd be great to connect more with people in New Hampshire.
I'm pretty
Yes,
sure.
hi.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I'm kind of the manager for the Wakefield Food Pantry. We have a small garden behind the food pantry that was started 6 or 7 years ago, and they started off tilling every year. And when I took over about 5 years ago, I went to this exact same system. We permanent beds, no tilling, use a broad fork occasionally because it was an old lot where they had taken the trees out and hadn't done much prep, and they just put the garden right over the top of what was left after the lot got cleared off. And who knows what the long-term history of the lot had been. But last year went to layers of cardboard. And I always did straw on the paths, but we're still having weed problems. So we went to layers of cardboard and then straw over that, and it knocked down our weeding last year tremendously. So, and also looking at the no dig stuff, although it's really hard to get volunteers to stop. They want to dig in there and pull the weeds out rather than twist them off at the top and not disturb the soil. So that's an ongoing process of getting, because people just love to cultivate the soil for some reason. So working on that, I hopefully have more success with no dig this year than last year. But getting the pass done, it cut down the hours we were spending at least in half by putting just, and it's a food pantry. So guess what? We have lots of cardboard boxes that go to the dump. So the source for the cardboard was right there. Right. So because all the stuff from the USD comes in cardboard boxes, nice big square cardboard boxes that are easy to put down on pass.
And that's much cheaper. Yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, and I've used I've redone my farm and home several times, and it's the same system. So
right. One thing, I don't have personal experience with this, but I've heard and read about other farms that have done this. So if, you know, you're a larger scale operation and this just isn't feasible to establish, just adding 2 or 3 inches of compost to your, so kind of establishing a permanent raised bed system without the wood chip or without the layer underneath. So you're just adding to the soil surface and then not disturbing. And I've heard that that's effective. Again, I don't have personal experience with it, but that could be a potential alternative.
Thank you. And then just to answer your question, if people had tried it or are using the permanent raised bed systems, Julie says Stonewall Farm has been doing it for 6 years. Kathy tried it, but found intermittent tillage was necessary due to gradual compaction, and that she ended up remaking the beds about every 3 years. And I think I remember Kearsarge Gore Farm is doing permanent raised beds also. And it looks like Ellen has her hand raised.
Yeah, so my question goes a little bit along with what Frank was talking about, cardboard. We are doing small raised bed resiliency gardens in Massachusetts, and we're doing it on public housing property, which unfortunately has probably a significant amount of lead, although we can't afford to test in their single units, so we can't afford to test like 30 houses. But what we were told that we could do is put layers of cardboard, not so that it gets wet, but dry layers, then put in soil that we've had to bring in from outside from like black earth compost, and then we boost it every year. So I was just wondering what your suggestions would be. We want to change out the layer. We've been doing that for 2 years. We wanted to change out the layer of cardboard, and I was just wondering if you think a layer of wood chips and then cardboard would be beneficial. I mean, I know this goes against the principles of what we want to do with soil, but we just can't take this chance, and the housing people are kind of strict on things. So does that sound reasonable to, like, when we change out the soil this year, we'll like put it on a tarp, we'll take out the old cardboard, put in new, and then maybe put wood chips underneath or above? I'm just kind of wondering what you're thinking with that thought.
Well, I have a question for you and a thought. So the question is there a permanent barrier between the soil that's there and then the cardboard?
No.
No. So if you think that there might be lead contamination, I think I would encourage you to try to have some sort of, if it's landscape fabric or something like that, to prevent, especially if you're only growing in the soil, because my worry would be that the lead could potentially get into your growing space, which could be scary. But then also my thought is that the cardboard is probably broken down. So if you take the soil out, it might, my guess is that you wouldn't see any cardboard. It would probably be all broken down. Does that?
Yeah, it makes me want to just start all over again. And, it's just such a frustrating, almost kind of no-win situation.
Yeah.
Because I know we can't get housing, and we can't ask each individual person to test their soil, and we can't afford to test like 20 houses.
Well, I think, and I don't know if others have suggestions or thoughts, but some sort of impermeable landscape fabric could be a good option just to keep the lead underneath and from getting into your growing space. And then you wouldn't need the wood chips. You could just put the soil in there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I saw the comment about the broad fork. That's a great option for loosening up the soil without disturbing the weed seed bank.
Do you use a broad fork?
We don't need one here because of the sand. but I can see how in some systems, depending on the soil, you would need one. And I think, one thing I've found, if, I haven't gotten a chance to cover beds, and there's a heavy rain and it's been several weeks, I definitely find the soil more compacted. But in the beds where I've ensured that they've had cover on them, whether with a cover crop or with salt marsh hay or chopped up leaves, they don't get compacted as quickly or at all. So keeping the beds covered has been really helpful for compaction, reducing compaction.
Thank you. You may have already covered this, but can you remind us when's the best time to start the process for this?
Anytime. Well, maybe not this time of year, but just say you have an acre in production and you leave half of it fallow and you grow in half of it, then maybe take the half that you leave fallow and start putting that in, converting that to the system, and then a year later you can flip. But it does take a year to establish. So I think I want to say that most of them we built in the spring, but it happened over the course of several years. So some of them may have been built at other times.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So, I guess we're getting close to the end time. I guess if there are no questions, do you want to add anything else before we close?
Just if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I can put my email address in the chat. And if you have experience with these systems, I'd love to talk with you more about it.
Great. And we do have Jennifer's contact information in the program guide also, if you would like to reach out to her. All right, I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you for being here today. Our next session is at noon today. That's Farming and Solar Power Partners for Resiliency. And I'll pop the workshop links in the chat in a moment. So here we go. Please support our conference exhibitors by checking out our virtual Green Market Fair and conference bookstore hosted by Main Street Bookends. And just a note about some upcoming programs. On February 17th, we have a Farm Bill listening session with our policy committee, and our Feeding the Family Organic Gardening Series starts February 22nd with 6 sessions held every other week through May 3rd. And check out our bulk order program to save on farming and gardening supplies. Ordering through NOFA helps support NOFA. And the order deadline for that is February 28th, with pickup on March 19th and 20th in Andover, New Hampshire, Ware, and Rochester. And thanks everyone for joining us.